Hello, this is the Captain Paxo, and I'm having difficulties with the PvP in this game. I should start off by saying that I love random invasions, and those of you who are already familiar with the state of random invasions, you can see where I'm going with this. At first, when I realized that random invasions was simply a gankfest, I altered my mindset to expect a gank situation, and honestly, to expect defeat. And, that kept me going for a while. However, if you go into a fight expecting defeat, what's the point in trying? What's the point in even using my red eye orb if I expect to be killed? Why should I waste my time and my effort only to feed a couple of soul-starved hollows? It'd be a different story if invaders weren't at such as an absurd disadvantage. 30% less health, half Estus, prioritizes world with existing phantoms, infinite summons, seed of giant tree, dark moonblade. Chasing is the hardest it's ever been with that ridiculous roll that you obtain at under 70% equipment load, and costs so little stamina anyway. Nerf to the Hornet's Ring? With all of this, it begs the question, why does From hate invaders? After all, they put invaders in the game, and now it's as if they want to remove them entirely, because they realise that too many players are not finishing the game because a dick wraith like me hunts those players for breakfast. And so realising this, From has decided to ever so slightly persuade dick wraiths like me to not invade, and it feels about as subtle as being thrown off a cliff. This inevitably means that they are sacrificing their more hardcore fan base for the more casual players. And the reason for that? Well, money, obviously. Let's say I invade and claim the embers of 10 new players. These players were already having difficulties with the game, and then suddenly this red dickhead comes along and steals away their souls. Bam! They rage quit. They say, fuck it, it's not worth it. And they never touch the game again. Why is this bad for From? Because that's 10 players who aren't going to beat the game. 10 players who won't buy the DLC. 10 players who won't buy the sequel, whatever that'll be. And whilst I don't know how the DLC will be priced at the moment, I do know that the sequel, if there is one, will be $60 US. That's $600 I've effectively cost them, because 10 players had to sacrifice their enjoyment in order for me to fulfill mine. Obviously 60 times 10 is 600. Meaning From has secured my $60 whilst losing 600. And that's only in one session of invasions and only from one player's doing. And of course this won't happen every session, but when you think about how much frustration you have caused to however many players, is it any surprise that From figured that a large portion of players are not buying these games because of the fear of invasions? But if you ask me, there needs to be a fear of invasions, or else the game just gets boring. Think about it, to the average player, once they understand the basics of the game, and they've beaten it maybe once or twice, they've experienced it before, it's all the same. And therefore it's harder to be interested. However, invasions makes it much more interesting for both parties, the invader and the host. Because it's new and different, You're not fighting the engine anymore, you're fighting another player, and you both know that. You have no idea what kind of equipment they'll have, nor how good they'll be. And besides, fear is all a part of playing a Souls game. The fear of death, of failure, the fear of losing your embered state or your souls. If there was no fear, then these games would never have gotten as popular as they did. You know it, I know it, and no one could argue otherwise. If you have no fear of losing, then you can never really feel the highs of winning. Which is what I think is so great about invasions. Or was so great, I should say, and I'll explain in a sec. There's always the fear of defeat, as there's always a chance that you can lose, no matter how bad someone is. Case in point, the #1 spot for the top 10 live reactions in Dark Souls 2 was taken by a 3-year-old. And that just goes to show that anyone can beat anyone on any given day. And saying that means that there's always a threat of failure. Now I know there are already people disagreeing vehemently in the comments, but listen, if someone does something you don't expect, then they will beat you. Even if you do expect it, you might fail to counter it for whatever reason, But at the same time, there's also always the potential for victory. and a deciding factor is the players themselves. You know, if one of them has poor stamina management and likes to block with a low stability shield and the other player knows how to perform a guard break, then he's going to get guard broken. But that won't stop him from roll spamming and getting his buddy in. And whilst I do believe that anyone can beat anybody on any given day, I don't think that a weak player should have an equal chance of winning as a strong player. And that's what random invasions can feel like because of the amount of tools that the host can use that the invader can't. Like I said, infinite summons, dark moonblades, seed of a giant tree, twice as much Estus, and the summons effectively have infinite Estus because if they run out and die they can simply be resummoned and have 7, whereas you'll be down to 3, maybe. This isn't just some disadvantage, this is brutally unfair. They might as well have infinite Estus. And this is all perpetuated by the role. The medium role in this game seems to have just as many, if not more iframes than the fast role in Dark Souls 1. You should not be able to be up to 70% equip load and still have a role that's just as powerful than if you had 0% equipment load. And to top it all off, rolling costs less stamina than an R1 from a straight sword, which already allows you 7 consecutive swings. It's completely juxtaposed from Dark Souls 2, where a roll costs more stamina than an R1 from a straight sword. Trust me, I've tested it. Even at 0% equipment load, it still had a mediocre amount of iframes. And whilst I understand that they wanted Dark Souls 3 to be as different as possible from Dark Souls 2, you know, because half of the community disliked 2, and that's including me, but I think this is too far. And this role allows for the host to infinitely summon phantoms if you're not using a straight sword or something else that can roll catch really well. And then the high-powered roll also brings into question the viability of heavy weapons, as you can simply roll through all their attacks, and even if you get hit, your armor will prevent you from being turned into minced meat. And with some weapons you won't even get a 2-hit guarantee, because your opponent's two-handing them, and if they one-hand, they can get sight parried, so they have to two-hand to be able to attack at all. But then they lose the ability to two-hit guarantee, in some cases, not all, I know. Whilst you, using probably a much lighter weapon, can still get the 2 hits. And that's something else that bugs me about PvP in this game, is heavy weapons. As I've just explained, they are really hard to use. And I know they've always been hard to use, but at least in Dark Souls 1, you had to sacrifice like your armor and stuff in order to get a good roll. And at least in Dark Souls 1 you could dead angle. I know it was a glitch and whatever, but you know. And in Dark Souls 2 it seems to me that it was much easier to roll catch with these heavy weapons because there was less iframes and more recovery frames, you know. It's as if people were screaming, I hate getting hit twice by heavy weapons and losing half my life. So From decided to try and solve that, but they can't just decrease the damage that they do, because that's the whole point of these kinds of weapons. So what do they do instead? Make it incredibly hard to land any hits with these kinds of weapons by making the roll ridiculously good. Now maybe this wasn't their reasoning for buffing the roll, but I'm not sure what other reason it would have been, you know? And if it wasn't, then they clearly didn't see the effect it would have on these weapons. If they did, then why would they remove the 2-hit guarantee on some of the great axes when two-handed? The obvious answer is because they can't be parried. Whilst I agree that there should be an exchange of a positive for a negative, I agree with that kind of mentality. These weapons are so slow that if you one-hand, your opponent will simply parry you. If you two-hand, your opponent will simply avoid you. So even though they do amazing damage, is it really worth using if you're not just fishing for criticals? But then that leads me to heavy armor. After all, a heavy weapon should be paired with heavy armor, right? Not according to Dark Souls 3. For those of you who haven't seen my Is Heavy Armor Really Worth It video, due to how armor works in this game, there's not really much point into putting points into vitality to be able to roll in heavy armor, because your defense is barely any better than if you put no points into vitality and wear light or medium armor. And better yet, those points that you didn't put into vitality can be put into something much more useful, like endurance or vigor. At the time of making this video, I've yet to be told any reason why anyone would want to wear heavy armor. So I'll ask again, why on earth would anyone put points into vitality for the sake of heavy armor? I get it for weapons, but I don't see much point for armor, especially if you're already above 20% damage absorption. We're going back to fishing for criticals, because, you know, I've got a decent amount that I want to talk about. Let's start with parry fishing, since it's so prevalent. I don't think it's because it's easier to do, I think it's because it's an easy way to do a lot of damage, since the only way to stun lock someone is if your opponent is either really bold or really stupid. That's it. And since stun locking isn't really in the picture, you can't do massive amounts of damage that way, so people look for an alternative. What you need to realize about pretty much everything in nature is that it will always take the easiest path. It will do whatever is the most efficient thing of its energy. That's why honeycombs are hexagons, not any other shape. And why rivers twist and turn as opposed to going in a straight line. I know there'll be some know-it-alls giving me a novel on the real reasons, but I'm not exactly wrong, am I? But anyway, it's the same with Dark Souls player. We will do whatever gives us the most amount of damage for the least amount of effort. Why did everyone backstab fish in Dark Souls 1? Because that's what the game taught them was the most efficient way of disposing of enemies. You know, James Atton's Happy Souls has a brilliant sketch on backstabs at about 8 minutes 40 seconds. I'll put the link in the description, which is all you really need to know about backstab fish's motives. It's easy and it does a lot of damage. But backstabbing in Dark Souls 3 is really wonky and really hard to pull off, so instead people are going for parries. The thing is, a riposte always does more damage than 2 R1s if you're using the same weapon. And since most people roll away after taking damage of any kind, you know, to contemplate healing, people want to do as much damage as possible to get a health and or Estus advantage, which in a random invasion is quite important, as the invader will usually have half as much Estus as the host, and both parties are prone to healing. There's also the fact that the invader will likely be going up against multiple opponents, and, you know, that means he has to damage that Estus race at least 2 foes. And the most efficient way to do this? Well, you know, Hornet Ring, heavy weapon, parry fish. After all, the lack of poise means that even 2 opponents can mess you up pretty bad if you make a single mistake. And since chasing people down is almost pointless in this game, the best course of action is to take out your opponent as quickly as possible, which entails doing as much damage as possible in as little time as possible. Hence why every invader ran with the Hornet's Ring. And this of course meant that people started to complain about getting one-shot by Hornets. But the Hornets was just a result of the frequency of gank situations, aka you versus multiple opponents. And for those complaining about Hornets in duels, I'd actually argue that that's due to having 4 ring slots. What else is your cookie cutter quality build supposed to use? Anyway, this is about random invasions, not duels, because, you know, this is coming from the perspective of an invader. So from nerfs the Hornet Ring. And that stops the newbies from being one-shot, from a punish for their brain-dead R1 spam, and to stop duelists from complaining about unfair fights. Everybody's happy, right? Wrong. The invader party is not happy because it's just made a massively uphill battle even harder to win. But then, like I talked about at the beginning of the video, FromSoft doesn't exactly give much of a damn about invaders. They want us gone for good, or at least that's the impression they're giving me. And it's not as if I can blame them. Businesses should always do what's in their best interest, and if that benefits the consumer, then all the better. And this does benefit the vast majority of players, because despite what you might think, invaders make up a tiny portion of the people who play this game. Most people play PvE exclusively, and a good amount of those players will only beat the game once or not at all. Despite From's best efforts at making the game beatable by even head trauma patients. But just because I can understand their motives doesn't mean I have to like it. Alright? I am insulted by how simplistic the PvP is in this game. I mean, you can roll 6 times with 10 endurance in this game, with the most powerful roll at 70% equipment load. That is twice as many rolls than you can perform in Dark Souls 2 with the same amount of endurance. Let's just put it this way. Everyone in Dark Souls 1 thought the Darkwood Grain Ring pre-patch was overpowered because you had an absurd amount of iframes and the distance that it took you was crazy, especially considering the amount of stamina it cost. And to top it all off, you could wear armor that put you up to 50% equipment load. So you had good armor, plus 53 poise, or whatever the recommended poise stat was, and you now had the best roll in the game. Sound familiar? Now I can already hear, you can't compare the Darkwood Grain Ring in Dark Souls 1 to the medium roll in Dark Souls 3. You're right. What if I mentioned the Karthus Blood Ring? Now I know it decreases your damage absorption, but when you can attain this roll at all the way up to 70%, it allows you to wear armor that gives you good damage absorption even with the Blood Ring. And bam! The same problem that was prevalent in Dark Souls 1 has made it into Dark Souls 3 even though they nerfed it in Dark Souls 1. Makes me wonder if they'll nerf it in 3, because, you know, FromSoft does have a habit of repeating their mistakes. Or trying to avoid the problems so bad that they end up creating new problems. Let's talk about Poise. Oh shit, did I just mention the P word? Yes, because it needs to be talked about. You know, the problem that was apparent in Dark Souls 1 because of Poise was the Poise backstab and the Poise parry, both of which could be countered if you have the know-how and can tell your opponent is going for it. But since backstabs are so different in Dark Souls 3, this wouldn't be an issue if or when they fix Poise. Currently the best explanation is that Poise affects your iframes in your roll. When you get hit, you supposedly lose a couple of iframes in your roll until you recover, and your poise affects how many iframes you lose. I'll link the Reddit post that explains this in the description, because it's pretty lengthy and quite detailed. However, one way or another, Poise is something that the devs weren't too happy with. According to a Kotaku article, I'll put the link in the description. According to Miyazaki himself, it can be improved. Those were his words, quote, "can be improved, and this is an agenda item we'll be working on in the future," end quote. So even if you think the Poise is fine the way it is, guess what? The devs don't. Now I don't know what kind of changes they'll make, or even if they'll make any changes at all, but it doesn't change the fact that the devs weren't happy with the way Poise was handled in this game. Main reason why I think Poise was so disappointing to so many of us is because we wanted Dark Souls 1 Poise, obviously, but From wanted to make it different from Dark Souls 1 Poise in order to justify the existence of Dark Souls 3. It was as if they were worried about Dark Souls 3 being too much like Dark Souls 1. I mean, you can see people looking at the similarities of these two games and going, what's the difference? It's just the same thing every year. Now, whilst morons like this probably couldn't even beat Udix Gundyr, this is your average gamer we're talking about. Simple-minded, lacking creative thinking, and problem-solving skills. Because every game they play solves the problems solve themselves. But anyway, because they want to make Dark Souls 3 as different from Dark Souls 1 as possible, while still making it recognizable as Souls, they have a mechanic in the game called Poise, because Poise is synonymous with Souls. But they change what it does. And whilst I understand this from the point of trying to change stuff, but change for the sake of change is rarely good change, especially when it changes something as fragile as Poise. How many times did I just say change in that sentence? Anyway, some would say if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But the Poise system in Dark Souls 1 wasn't perfect, although that's mainly due to the magnetic backstabs in that game, which when coupled with the Poise allowed a player who knew what they were doing to simply fish for backstabs and fish successfully. Let's put a bow on this topic. Poise in Dark Souls 3 has made some people feel cheated, and the devs regret what they did with the mechanic. God knows how they'll change it, if they do at all, or how it'll affect the game. No, that's out of the way. Let's talk about the Dark Moons, or the Sentinels of Blue, or both. or as I like to call these guys, the blueberries. Why in God's name are there two covenants that do exactly the same thing and have exactly the same rewards? Why? Why did they remove the indictment and guilty system? And why does it take so goddamn long to get summoned as a blueberry? Well, that one I can answer. It's because there aren't enough people running around in Ember form with the Way of the Blue Covenant on. Why is that the case? Well, I can answer that one too. Because what's the incentive? It's not like invaders are much of a threat anyway. What's the point in calling for protection against invaders when you don't bloody need it? Now, I'm not saying that everyone's like this. No, I'm just saying that there are more people looking to be summoned as a blueberry than there are actually people summoning. But when I invade, I always come across dark moons, is what some of you are saying. Well, we already know that invading prioritizes worlds with phantoms in them. Would it really be much of a stretch to say that invading prioritizes hosts who use the Way of the Blue Covenant? I mean, it's still effectively prioritizing a world with phantoms, right? It's just the phantoms haven't arrived yet. Now, I don't know if this is the case or not, but it's an interesting thought, isn't it? But anyway, I think, you know, most of the time you're going to be in the minority if you say I've come across dark moons all the time. I understand why dark moons exist. It's the same reason that invading prioritizes worlds with phantoms in it, to protect hosts. Why? Because a host is usually, but not always, a noob when it comes to playing PvP. So when this hotshot PvP expert comes in with their decked out gear, it puts the host in the unfortunate position of simply playing the victim. Hence why From implemented systems to prevent this, such as matching players up based on their gear as well as their soul level. Now, I actually agree with this move because it makes twinking so much harder to do. I don't know if it's impossible, which I honestly doubt very much, but it's certainly made it difficult. Actually, let's think about this from a new perspective. Most lone hosts won't get caught after a difficult section by a bonfire anymore, which they can just light and die with no fear of losing their souls, because their souls will be right there. The thing is, for every argument that lone hosts used to be able to make against invaders, can't anymore, because there's a workaround for everything. Only want to summon for a boss? Then you can make the journey in unembered form and then use an ember once you get there. It's not a humanity that you have to use at a bonfire. But the thing is, From fixed some of the things lone or hosts and phantoms were complaining about, and then gave them compensation, as if to say, sorry it took so long to nerf invaders, hope you can keep your PvE rampage going for infinity with this. Whilst in the meantime, invaders are now the victim. They fixed one problem, but then they made a new one. Now, I'm sure there are people in the comments saying something along the lines of, I don't know what you're talking about, invasion's just fine for me, you're just a scrub. And whilst, yes, I am a scrub, compared to you, hotshot, and whilst those people who have left those comments, you know, they probably haven't stuck around to listen to my counter-argument, but here's it anyway. Martyr's Brigade doesn't think invasions are fine. Ouroboros doesn't think invasions are fine. Scott Jund, aka DamnoHTML, doesn't think invasions are fine. Hundreds of Redditors don't think invasions are fine. Sorry, I shouldn't put words in people's mouth. Let's say that they think there's a large room for improvement in random invasions. Let's just say that they think that they're not preferable to duels. Let's just say that. So, for the large majority of us, PvP or random invasions are not fine. They are not easy. They are not fair. You know what's interesting is I've actually recently been able to get the ganker's perspective from all of this, and I can safely say that it was the most laid back and casual PvP experience in this game. Because you know there's little threat of failure. There's 3 of you all in communication again together, fighting against usually 2 opponents who are in no communication whatsoever. And then there's no fear of death, as you don't lose your souls when you die as a white, unlike a red. And if you do die, host can simply re-summon you in at no extra cost, and then bam! You've got all your Estus back too. And that brings me to something else. When you die as a red, you leave your souls where you died in the world. Now I get that there should be a penalty for dying in an invasion, but why don't summons have this penalty too? You know those hosts who complain about phantoms chasing after reds screaming, "Leroy Jenkins!" and end up dying? Well, it's because there's no penalty for dying as a phantom. Fuck it, right? You don't lose anything when you die, so what's the point in holding on to your life like it's the Holy Grail or something? I've started spending my victory souls before each of my next invasion because I've given up on retrieving my bloodstain. I don't want to interrupt my PvP session by doing some by fighting some PvE guys that might kill me before I get my bloodstain back because it was left in an awkward place because it was an invasion and I wasn't concentrating on the enemies because I'm doing my best to ignore them because I've already done this song and dance 20 times and I'm sick of it. So I say fuck it, yeah? I'm done with this shit. I don't care about those souls anymore. It's not fucking worth it. At which point, that takes away half of the fun of winning. We all take satisfaction in watching the souls counter go up for the same reason people like seeing the points pop up in Call of Duty. It tells you that you've done something good. You see that number? You see it going up? That's because you did something good. It was always cool to see the amount of souls someone had whilst doing PvP, because you could gauge how much that someone had played with that build, and it kind of strokes that ego when you're the one with 9 million souls, because you know how long it took you to earn that. How many victories and defeats, how many close calls and draws. Now, the most amount of souls that you'll usually see on someone carrying, it's less than 25,000. Bear in mind, I'm talking about people who do random invasions, not duels. I mean, the most I've ever seen someone in a video, doing random invasions, is 119,000. A lot of the time, it's just 0. And that's even from the people who love random invasions. And I know I'm being nitpicky here, but look, this is the game that was supposed to mark a turning point in the series, and a lot of people, myself included, thought that this was going to be the best Souls game ever. And maybe it is for you, but it's not for me. And in the end, it was naive to think that it would be the best. So why bring all this up? Why do you still play it if you don't like it? Because I want to like this game, I really do. But, if these problems aren't brought up, if they're not repeatedly brought up over and over again, then From won't see how much of a problem these things are. They won't see how much of an oversight they've made in some of these instances. Now, I'm not saying that my video alone will create the best Souls title ever, but I've put my 2 cents into the problem. If you like the video, please rate and share. And stay tuned for my next one, where I'll talk about my suggestions for improving the game. So thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.